Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into part 3 of John Brown on Extra History. This is Bleeding Kansas. The link is in the description to part 1 of this reaction if you have not seen the first 2 episodes, as well as the original content. I'm recording all of these ahead of time as I'm off to Tennessee, so I will see you when I get back to record part 4. Let's dive in.
May 22nd, 1856. The Senate Chamber, Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
Representative Preston Brooks walks into the hall, 2 other congressmen at his back, stopping by the desk of Senator Charles Sumner. 2 days before, Sumner had delivered a fiery speech called The Crime Against Kansas, excoriating his slaveholding colleagues, especially Senator Andrew Butler. "Mr. Sumner," Brooks says, "I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is libel in South Carolina, and Mr. Butler is a relative of mine." Sumner barely looks up before Brooks raises his gold-headed walking cane and brings it down on Sumner's head, again and again. Brooks's allies then pull weapons and prevent other senators from intervening. Trapped between his chair and desk, Sumner can't rise or defend himself, but finally he extricates himself and staggers away, blinded by blood. Brooks follows, still beating Sumner with his now broken cane, even as he loses consciousness. Blood begins to pool on the Senate floor. Blood that will run as far as Kansas.
Yeah, 100% true. And this is just one of those events that we talk about in this string of things that are happening. It goes way beyond the 1850s, but the 1850s is when it goes from being a problem to being a crisis. And these events are all just ratcheting up the tension. And you know how it goes, right? You're having a really bad day and you're in a bad mood and everything goes wrong. And then somebody says something that just sets you off. And normally them saying that wouldn't have done that. But because of everything else that has happened to you all day long, your tension is at its height and you just spill over because of that thing that just breaks it. That's what's happening in the 1850s. These things are raising what's been boiling under the surface for several generations, and by 1860 you're at a breaking point.
Would you like to see the next episode of this series immediately after watching this one instead of having to wait a full week? Well, luckily with Nebula First, you totally can. Learn how after the episode. The caning of Charles Sumner was a symbolically crucial moment, one that demonstrated how polarized the nation had become over slavery. It was also the event that pushed John Brown over the edge. Brown arrived in Kansas in late 1855 to find his 5 sons living in crisis. They were sick, short on food, and living in tents within a small settlement they'd named Brown's Station. As quickly as he could, he nursed them back to health and knocked together a couple of log cabins to ride out the bitter winter that was just around the corner. But cold wasn't the only danger. Brown's Station and the nearby abolitionist settlement of Osawatomie, where Brown's in-laws lived, were surrounded by pro-slavery settlers determined to drive them out. These men had threatened Brown's sons and relatives. They'd passed written death threats to 2 men Brown knew.
Sincerely, a ruffian.
And beaten a local shopkeeper. In one particularly nasty incident, they'd cornered a young woman who'd been helping Brown's son Frederick make bullets for Free State militias and threatened to sexually assault her. And elsewhere in Kansas, threats had become very real.
So at this time, this is the Wild West, right? Settlement has gone to California, but it hasn't gone much in between, and Utah too. But the kind of stuff that we're going to see a generation later in places like New Mexico and Arizona is kind of what's happening here. You're on the frontiers of the country. These are newly settled territories. These are places where people who couldn't make it other places or people who had a reason to get away from other places have come. And so there's a certain kind of person. A lot of these people, they know what they're getting into when they go there. They're going there looking for a fight. And they're going to find enemies. So this is all just more ramping up of the tension. And it's like, I don't remember the name of the movie. Did you ever see the movie where they put all the criminals into a confined space and they lock them all up there and then just kind of leave them to fend for themselves? I'm not saying these people are all criminals, but that's kind of what you have happening here. You have a convergence of opposing sides of a very contentious and violent issue ready to fight.
A pro-slavery man shot and killed his abolitionist neighbor, and then, in the depths of that icy winter, a Free State man was hacked to death and his frozen body parts dumped on his own doorstep. Kansas was rapidly heading towards civil war, and Brown, seeing this, founded his own militia company, getting ready to fight if need be. Also, after the fraudulent elections of 1855, where pro-slavery militias had captured the state legislature, the Free State camp decided to hold their own elections and form their own government. So yeah, now there were two rival governments in Kansas, one pro-slavery and one Free State, both with armed militias.
And this is something that will happen in the Civil War too, right? There will be in Kentucky, for example, a pro-Confederate government in Kentucky and a pro-Union government in Kentucky.
However, the Franklin Pierce administration, staunchly pro-slavery and happy to ignore the flagrant electoral cheating,
And Franklin Pierce is a Northerner. He's from New Hampshire. So it's this weird thing that's happening where you have guys like Pierce, who's a Northerner, who kind of takes the side of the pro-slavery issue. And you have guys like Zachary Taylor, who had been president, who was from Kentucky, who was a slave owner, who was much more sympathetic to the Free State people.
considered the Free State rebels and allowed the new governor to appoint Missouri militia leaders as sheriffs. This essentially let the border ruffians, not only Missourians now, but mercenaries and volunteers from all over the South, harass Free Staters under the cover of law. In April of 1856, Sheriff Samuel Jones, a border ruffian leader, entered the abolitionist capital of Lawrence on a mission to arrest leaders of the Free State legislature. When he was eventually shot and driven out of town, he then convinced a grand jury to give him legal power to crush Lawrence. And he returned on May 21st with an army of 800 border ruffians.
800. Could you imagine what 800 people with the cover of the law are going to do to their enemies?
Now, a similar standoff the previous year had been de-escalated, but not this time. The border ruffians surrounded Lawrence, disarmed the residents, and sacked the town. They broke windows and destroyed a legislator's house. They smashed the presses of 2 abolitionist newspapers, and they attacked the largest, strongest building in town, the Free State Hotel. First with a cannon, then detonating gunpowder in the lobby, and when none of that worked, simply by burning it down. Though there were few casualties, the property devastation was considerable. And as luck would have it, John Brown heard about the sacking of Lawrence and the caning of Senator Sumner on the same day. He was furious.
Here's a guy who's already basically of the attitude, I'm giving my life to this cause. He's already come out there to protect his sons from these people. Now he hears about these things. That's it.
Now, to this point, the violence and threats in Kansas had been incredibly one-sided. Oh, but no more. If they wanted violence, he would give them violence. Enough that these border ruffians would think twice before threatening or attacking another Free Stater. Basically, they hecked around, and now they were going to find out. Brown handpicked a team from his militia company, consisting of his sons Owen, Solomon, Frederick, and Oliver, plus 2 men who'd also been threatened. They took along old U.S. Army broadswords with mercury-filled channels in the blades, so the liquid metal increased the force of the swing.
So, again, this goes back to my question I asked at the beginning of episode 1. At what point does violence become the answer? And so put yourself, and listen, I'm not defending, I'm just trying to offer context here. Put yourself in the position of the Free State people. You've seen the slave powers take power with fraudulent elections. You have seen, and please don't make parallels to today. I know where you're going to go with this. This is very clear, incontrovertible evidence we have that these elections were overwhelmingly fraudulent. You have people being attacked, beaten, in some cases killed, raped. You have a senator being attacked on the Senate floor by a Southern congressman. You have all of this happening and all protected by the law. What do? Is there a legal recourse for you, or do you feel like you have no other option? That's where they're at.
Then they targeted the neighbors who'd harassed and threatened them. First, there was James Doyle and his 2 sons that we talked about in episode 1. They hacked all 3 men to death in their front yard. They did the same for another militiaman, and at a 3rd cabin, they found nearly half a dozen men. Through questioning them, they found only one who was in fact a border ruffian and killed him as well. It was the start of John Brown's war on slavery. As far as he was concerned, it was ridiculous to consider the killing of a few oppressors too high a price, given the millions of black Americans who were abused, beaten, raped, and murdered due to the practice of slavery. But gut check time. If you're feeling a little queasy about this, that makes sense, because while Brown's logic about liberation might be sound, this kind of violence always triggers reprisals and escalation. Brown's actions.
And inevitably, people get killed who weren't a part of it, right? So, for example, you got the Nat Turner Rebellion that took place, I think, in Virginia a couple of decades before this. Kids are getting murdered, right? And you might argue, well, their parents were slave owners. Okay, well, even if you blame the parents for owning slaves, they were children. You know, you don't do these kinds of things without there being unintended consequences.
Called the Potawatomi Massacre, was the starting gun for the factions to go at it. In the next 4 years, at least 56 political killings occurred during what came to be called Bleeding Kansas. And it would culminate in an incident where border ruffians lined 11 unarmed Free Staters up at the edge of a ravine and shot them execution style. But that was the future. Right now in this historical tale, both militias and U.S. Army troops hunted Brown. One militia burned Brown's station and arrested 2 of Brown's sons who had nothing to do with the killings, even torturing John Jr. Brown responded by rallying the 13 men of his militia company and attacking the 55-strong border ruffian encampment, besieging their circled wagons in the Battle of Blackjack and taking 23 prisoners.
13 men attacked nearly 60 men, surrounded them, and won. Pretty vicious stuff.
By now, both sides were trading attacks, stealing livestock, and destroying crops. And on August 30th, a group of over 250 border ruffians came for Brown at Osawatomie. The only Brown they found was Frederick. One of Brown's favorite sons, Frederick struggled with mental illness, and his father had always tried to both include him in the family struggle while also protecting him. At Potawatomi, he served as a lookout, not a killer, and he'd been kept away from the fighting at Blackjack. A scout found him walking down the town's main street and shot him through the heart. Brown's militia went into action, trying to defend the town against the force 5 to 10 times their number equipped with cannons, but it was truly no use. He withdrew and watched them burn the town to the ground. It was a deep and personal loss, but Brown's bravery at Osawatomie and his growing reputation as a guerrilla leader had begun to turn him into a sort of folk hero.
Yep.
The citizens of Lawrence cheered him when he next entered the town. Northern newspapers, whose reporters he'd cultivated, lauded him, while Southern presses called him a murderer and fumed that he had not yet been caught.
There's no middle ground with this guy, right? He hasn't left room for there to be middle ground. He's either a hero or a villain, and not too many people were on the fence when it came to him. Much like how Abraham Lincoln was viewed, right? Abraham Lincoln becomes deified in the North, and he's vilified in the South. Just all depends on what side of the issue you're on and whether or not you see him as a hero or a terrorist. Now, with 100 plus years of, 160, 170 years of distance, we can look at these things a little more objectively. And I kind of see him somewhere in between personally. But there wasn't room for that back then.
He was increasingly becoming known to friend and foe alike, simply as Old Brown. Oh, and his enemies in Kansas feared him. There was a real sense that if any pro-slavery man decided to pick up a weapon, Old Brown might come for them in the night. And as the violence escalated, backfiring on the Pierce administration, the government increasingly changed its policies to try to curb the bloodshed, even at the cost of Kansas becoming a free state. But by then, Brown was no longer in Kansas. Rather, he was in Boston and New York, meeting with the wealthy benefactors who had bought weapons for the Free Staters. He was a celebrity there, the one man who'd finally stood up to Southern violence when other abolitionists had offered only petitions, letters, and newspaper editorials.
So if you're Brown at this point, you're like, all right, Kansas is one thing, but we need to take this national, right? We need to go to the heart of slavery in the South and get the people to rise up there and deal with this issue once and for all. He's not getting any younger. He's already lost a son now to this violence. Something's got to give.
And what Brown wanted now was simple: more money and more guns. He met opposition. In one meeting, he went head-to-head with William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator editor and advocate for nonviolent abolitionism. Brown went hard at Garrison for his ideas of gradual emancipation. I mean, could enslaved people wait while they were whipped, their families sold, and their wives and daughters subject to assault? Brown got his rifles, including funding from a more radical group of benefactors who called themselves the Secret Six, who were willing to back him for more than keeping up the struggle in Kansas. Which was good, because Brown was done running guns to Kansas. Indeed, he was assembling a strike team to hit a new target, the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. John Brown was about to take his war for liberation to the heart of the South.
And we are going to visit Harper's Ferry at some point, hopefully later this year. I'll take you to the site where these things happened. We'll go to the site where he was hanged, where the trial happened, all of it fascinating stuff, but that's for another day. We'll see you when I get back from Tennessee. Thanks for watching.